as individuals and how they move towards hope. And can you tell us, how did you begin to get into this particular topic of working with people who are really dealing with great difficulties?
Well, first of all, I think probably everyone can relate to the idea of having difficulties or challenges in life. And our challenges might take on different flavors or colors, but we all have to deal with those bumps in the road. They can be little or they can be big. And I certainly have had mine as well, so I can relate to that. I feel like there's multiple answers to it. It's a little bit multi-layered. And I myself ask myself this question: why do I write what I write? You know, why do I choose these somewhat difficult topics? People are like, you take on some really hard stuff here. And I think I tried to explore it in Dear Orchid to answer that question for myself.
Yeah.
Where did this initial empathy for people with disabilities come from?
Yeah.
And I share the story Dear Mr. 10 Speed in Dear Orchid, in which when I was a child, I met a gentleman in my neighborhood, and I realized, although we were interacting, that he never spoke a word. The way he introduced himself was he was wearing a baseball cap, and he ran his finger along the cap to show me the word Richard, to tell me his name. And even though there was this gender difference, this age gap, and the fact that we could never speak a word to each other, somehow we had a connection. And so I write about that, and when you read Dear Mr. 10 Speed, you will hear that story.
So would you say that it's from this particular childhood experience?
I think that was one, but as I think back, there were other moments where I also had this empathy perhaps for somebody who was different. And there's a little story that I share, the one where I write about Sergeant Brian Anderson.
Yes, yeah.
I share the story when I went to preschool as a 3-year-old, and in the 3-year-old class one day a 2-year-old joined as well, and she was being made fun of by the 3-year-olds because she was still in diapers. And so she started to, you could see her chin wobble and her lip quiver and the tears starting. So I put my arm around her and I brought her over to the sandbox to show her where to play. It was her first day. And so I don't know that I totally know the answer. Like there's something in early experiences or just, seeing that somebody needed that arm around them. And
you talk about the stories in here, because your format doesn't follow, the traditional, which I love that there's musings, there's short stories, and there's these introductions to these different characters, and you talk about meeting your heroes. And sometimes when we meet our heroes, we may be disappointed. And I love the fact that you bring that in. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because you talk, when you are talking about Sergeant Brian Anderson and 2 other characters in one of the places in this book, actually, that had a little trepidation about first meeting, for instance, Sergeant Anderson. You had some trepidation. And I think as a reader I can understand that, but can you explain to us that whole idea of where you did get the desire maybe to see if meeting your heroes was going to live up to your expectations?
And so for those who don't know Sergeant Brian Anderson, he's a Purple Heart decorated veteran who was injured in Iraq serving the United States military. And the reason I reached out to him was as I was working on research for Goodbye Orchid, in which Phoenix suffers the accident after the train accident. I reached out to Brian because I'd read his memoir, and I simply said, first of all, I just said thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for writing your memoir. He writes about the experience of his Humvee being blown up in Iraq and losing both his legs and his left hand in that one instant. Talk about life-changing in an instant. And so he was so generous, when he heard that I was writing a book in which a character had injuries perhaps similar to combat wounded veterans. He said, let's spend some time together so I can show you how easy I make it look to be a triple amputee. And you're right, I was nervous before meeting him, and probably for 2 reasons. One is a practical one, which is I had actually never spent much time with somebody in a wheelchair, and I didn't know the etiquette, and I wasn't sure, do I bend down to be at his level? So I tried to do a little research, but I was a little nervous for that. But also, I think because I read his memoir and
Mhm.
felt like I knew him through, at that point, our emails and our phone conversations, I had put him on a pedestal.
All right.
You know, he actually said he doesn't like being called a hero because he didn't choose to be blown up. However, he does recognize what he did choose is how he was going to react
Mhm.
to the idea
Mhm.
of now living missing 3 limbs.